In the last few years, Portland has been in the spotlight on the national level for protests, riots, vandalism, and clashes between political groups. So much so that the Rose City was heavily featured in an analysis by Reuters about political violence in the U.S. We think their coverage is worth your time. They took a look at incidents of political violence across the country since the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. The headline sums it up pretty well, we think. Political violence in polarized U.S. at its worst since 1970s. They documented 213 cases of political violence in the U.S. since January 6th. Of those, 39 people were killed. We talked with Reuters investigative reporter Ned Parker, one of the authors of the article.
We started talking about doing this towards the end of last year, in part because of the heightened rhetoric and events at the time of the 2022 midterm elections, when the attack happened on Nancy Pelosi's house and the assailant fractured Paul Pelosi's skull. That was a real alarming moment. And just because so much had happened since January 6th and the nature of that event, we just started looking at, well, how should we be looking at this phenomenon of political violence?
And how should we even define it? So they decided they would define it as incidents that were linked to an election or a partisan political dispute or any premeditated acts driven by an ideology that could be identified. They did not include, by the way, random hate crimes or incidents of police violence. But they did include hate crimes that had a clear ideological standpoint. As I said, they identified 213 cases of political violence that fall under the definition since January 6th of 2021. 76 of those were individual acts of violence between people. 58 were among dueling groups at protests and events. 6 involved ramming a car into people at public events, and 73 were considered violence, but they mainly resulted in destruction to property rather than personal injury. The reporters looked at the ideology behind each incident and found that an overwhelming amount of the deadly violence came from people who consider themselves conservatives. 13 deadly attacks resulting in 34 people killed came from people with clear right-wing political views. Only one political attack was tied to someone with a left-wing viewpoint. Now, I can already hear some of you getting your email fingers ready to say, whoa, 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 whoa. What about all the violence and vandalism we saw in Portland the last few years from people on the left? Well, thank you for asking about that. The reporters did find an overwhelming amount of property damage came from people with a left-leaning ideology. Of those 73 cases of property violence they counted, they say the vast majority did come from folks on the left. One of the cases of deadly violence they focused on was the deadly mass shooting in Normandale Park in February of last year. That's when 60-year-old June Knightley was shot and killed. She was a longtime social justice advocate, and she was doing traffic control as part of a Black Lives Matter protest. A man living near the park, Benjamin Smith, started harassing protesters and eventually pulled out a gun and shot 5 of them. Knightley was killed. Others were badly hurt. One person paralyzed. Earlier this year, Smith was sentenced to life in prison. After Smith pleaded guilty, Knightley's wife blamed the rhetoric around social justice for the murder.
The Portland Police Bureau, as well as local and national politicians and pundits, had long characterized people associated with racial justice protests as threats to the peace, thereby giving potential vigilantes license to take violent action on their own behalf.
Smith's roommate told reporters that since the pandemic started, he had become increasingly agitated about politics, that he posted his grievances against liberals online, sometimes making racist, anti-Semitic remarks, and that he would throw tantrums and shout about shooting liberal activists. Smith eventually emailed the reporters from jail and told them, hey, the shooting was about much less than politics than people think, but he did not elaborate. And when the Reuters reporters examined other cases of political violence, they found that the violence often did go beyond political ideology. They say there are a lot of factors in play, that some of the people committing political violence are also dealing with issues of mental health, family concerns, or other personal issues.
What the proportion of it is that's truly political and what proportion of it is the personal, that's hard to say. But these acts of violence are really a mirror on different problems in our society.
Reuters says they heard varying explanations for the rise in political violence, financial anxiety, the COVID pandemic, changing demographics in America, and coarse political rhetoric coming from the Trump era. You can check out the entire article now at Reuters.com. And by the way, let us know what you think about this. You can email your thoughts to thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090.